Today in W203, I wanted to kind of go back to a basic unit or measure within the poem itself, which is the line. How does a poet define an individual line within a particular piece of poetry? And so how does the line fit within the larger poem, within the formal poem or within a free verse poem? So there you are staring at the blank page as a space, and you're trying to write a poem. How do you think about the bits that fit together to form the larger poem? And one of these bits is the poetic line. As we look at the line itself, we kind of need to make a distinction here again between prose and poetry. The prose itself is kind of broken up into individual pieces, such as the page, the sentence, the paragraph, etc. But prose itself, as you read a piece of fiction or nonfiction, those smaller breakdowns are not essential to the meaning of the larger piece of writing in the way that they are with poetry, right? That prose, even though it's broken up into pages and paragraphs and sentences, almost could be read like it's language coming out of a stock ticker, a long line of language, one sentence after another, one paragraph after another, one page after another. With poetry, though, those individual bits of sound are important because poetry is primarily meant to be a spoken language or sung language, perhaps even almost incantational or magical in some ways, according to some poets, that the way that things are said has great power in defining how a poem means in the end. So we want to break the poem down into bits here, and today we're going to concentrate on line. Those spaces become very important as you try to get feeling or emotion onto the page of the poem. You know, how do you put anger on a page, or how do you put joy on a page, or desire or love? How do you put those kinds of feelings on the page? How the poem appears on the page is part of the meaning that's there within those feelings. So we can think about the basic ways that a poem can be broken down into spaces. The first is the form itself. You're a little familiar with form here. Perhaps you've read sonnets in the past, or in this course we've looked at the sestina, Ezra Pound's Sestina Alta Forte, where the poem itself is set up into kind of regular recurrent bits of sound, those words that end each of the 6 lines in the sestina. The stanza in the poem, which is kind of a paragraph like, where the poet is breaking things down into a little bit smaller units. And then the thing we're concentrating on today, which is the line, the individual line of poetry. What defines a line? Where does the poet decide to break the line and move on to the next line within the poem? Below the line are units called metered units, which are those recurrent sonic patterns in a very kind of basic way, little bits of sound. For instance, one is called the iamb, which is simply an unaccented beat followed by an accented beat within a line of poetry. So, ta-dum. The sonnet is an example of a formal poem that uses meter. It is a collection of 5 iambs per line, so 5 bits of sound per line that go da-dum, 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 da-dum. That rhythm follows throughout the sonnet. And so metered verse depends on, the line of the metered verse depends on recurrent bits of sound that are mathematically measured for the poem. When we look at the poetic line, we should compare metered verse to free verse here, especially. Metered verse, which, like I say, depends on mathematically defined bits of sound. The line is a regular repetition of particular bits of sound. And how that differs from free verse, which does not depend on any kind of mathematically measured bits of sound. One critic of free verse claims that writing poems in free verse is like playing tennis without a net, and that might seem true, but the question is there perhaps some other kinds of recurrent patterns that are present in conversational language that free verse tries to bring in, particularly in a language like English, which is not inflected like Spanish or French or Italian, that there are particular ways of saying things, particularly when those are defined by feeling. Is there a song to speech? Is there a song to angry speech? Is there a song to joyous speech? And how does the poet try to recover that sense of song that's underneath the language, perhaps through free verse? Kenneth Koch here says that the goal, one of the goals of poetry is to recover the natural rhythms of speech. And so how does free verse attempt to do that, perhaps, in comparison to metered verse? An example of metered verse here would be something like Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, first line of which is, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Where there's kind of an undercurrent pattern of iambs within that line by Shakespeare. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Compare that to an example of a free verse sentence. A sentence like, "I went to the store for milk and cigarettes." There are certain ways to say that, right? There are certain ways that where certain patterns of repetition that exist within the language there, and your task as a poet is to kind of perhaps capture those cadences of American speech and put them into verse. Like to recall the language, all those instances of language that you've known from being a child, and you're trying to kind of rethink how American speech works, perhaps as you write the poem. We can rethink Shakespeare's line here to kind of rethink, how that line is measured or metered in a way. The metered speech of the sonnet, the use of iambic pentameter, is certainly poetic, but there's certainly other poetic effects that are present within poetry as well that affect its sound and its measure. For instance, the persona of the poem, the speaker of the poem, creates a certain poetic effect. The device of apostrophe, that is, to whom is the poem being addressed, to whom is the poet speaking within the poem. There are points of comparison which offer poetic effects, and just that whole task of trying to fit feeling into the poem, to put feeling into language, is a poetic task for sure. I always like to think about the sonnet as kind of like a little thinking machine. What I mean by that is that you're going to write a sonnet on the page, so you're going to follow meter, but you're speaking about something that may seem very irrational. Well, you might be writing about love, you might be writing about sexuality, you might be writing about death, all things that are very have very irrational aspects to them, but you're trying to force kind of an arithmetic measured language onto that irrational subject. So as you're trying to fit the language onto the subject, it forces you to rethink the subject more deeply. And so that's what the real power of the sonnet is for me as a poet, is that it forces you to rethink things in a way. If you look at Shakespeare's line, though, in the sonnet, think about how you can vary the points of comparison that might be very different from the way the meter works in the poem. So compare these. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? If you put the emphasis on that first shall, the poet's asking, should I do this or should I not, perhaps? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall the poet compare thee as opposed to someone else comparing thee? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Or the poet's asking, shall I compare you to the summer's day or someone else, perhaps? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day or a winter's day or an autumn day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day versus summer's night, a summer's morn, summer's afternoon? So where those effects are not necessarily always there, given by the meter, that's implicit in the language. That you can play with the sounds and emphasis within a line, and come to some really interesting effects. Particularly, like you take something that sounds exactly like summer's day, and you drop it into the poem, and what strange things happen when you do this. Shall I compare thee to a Chevrolet, which has the exact same sound as a summer's day, but changes the poem in some some very interesting kinds of ways by introducing this comparison between the beloved and an American car. Some poets argue that the line is defined simply by breath. That is, that whatever you can sound out in one breath it becomes a line. So, to consider this, like think about a long book-length poem like Allen Ginsberg's Howl here, and these are each lines within Ginsberg's Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, who changed themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth-racked, and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo. Ginsberg writes the poem in a series of very long lines. And some people say that he claimed that by when you tried to read the poem aloud and read these long lines aloud, you would almost hyperventilate by trying to suck in enough air to read each of these lines. So there'd be kind of almost a psychological effect to reading the poem aloud bit by bit. So Ginsberg kind of almost felt like he entered a holy space, a prophetic space, when he was reading these long lines one after the other and hyperventilating in the end. In some ways the line may be defined by breath. In some ways that playing around with that sense of how much breath you can use in a line may lead you to some interesting effects as well poetically. And then finally here, like think about like the sense of play that you can take within poetic language, within free verse, and by playing around with the length of a line. A poem you may already be familiar with from the Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks, "We Real Cool," which describes a group of teenagers who play pool. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So you get this kind of like interesting effect within the lines where you have a rhyme almost with the lines that is from the repetition of the word we bit by bit. You have a verb that starts each of the lines as you go down the page, describing the we's activities, down to the last line, we die soon, which is the erasure of the we, the loss of the we, who disappear, in the midst of these activities and burn themselves out. It's interesting, the short kind of syncopated effect of the lines, right? That Brooks trying to bring in a sense perhaps of American jazz that she overhears, jazzy language, and the bits and pieces of these one syllable words repeated one after the other, but also kind of heightened by that ending we. The subject of the sentence always ends the line, and the next line begins with a verb. So you can play around with that sense of the line in that way as well. This is called enjambment, where the line is not simply defined by a unit of like a sentence, but the sentence continues over into the next line. So don't be afraid to play around with these effects as well as you redefine the poetic line in your own writing.